I was 32 Terran Standard when I inherited the warrant. My father died in his command throne aboard the Vengeance of Markets, a cerebral hemorrhage during warp transit. The ship's Medicae recorded his death at 1447 shipboard time. I was summoned from my quarters, still wearing the simple grey tunic I'd worn to study trade ledgers. His skin had already cooled when I touched his hand. The warrant of trade passed to me in that moment, a physical object of aged parchment and wax seals, and a legal reality that transformed me from heir apparent to master of 6 vessels, 42,000 souls, and trading rights across 17 sector groups. The warrant's weight surprised me. 1 kilogram, perhaps slightly more. Heavier than it looked. The seal of the High Lords of Terra impressed into crimson wax, alongside my family's crest. A balance scale crossed with a plasma torch. My grandfather had earned it 4 generations prior, opening trade routes through the Calixis sector when it was still half-explored frontier. The document gave our family rights that superseded planetary governors, that permitted travel beyond imperial borders, that authorized commerce with aliens when sanctioned by necessity and profit. That final clause. I remember my father explaining it when I was 19, during my training in the warrant's privileges and restrictions. Necessity and profit, he'd said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many years breathing recycled ship air. The Imperium understands that its borders are porous. That trade sustains worlds. The warrant permits what dogma condemns, within limits. He'd never elaborated on what those limits were. I hadn't asked. The question seemed theoretical then. I remember the smell of my father's ready room. Amasec, the expensive kind from Scintilla, mixed with the ever-present oil and ozone scent of ship systems, and beneath it the faint mustiness of old parchment. He kept physical books, a costly affectation. I sold most of them after his death, kept 3. One was a treatise on Xenos trade commodities from the rogue trader Meridian, written M40.876. I consulted it frequently in those first years. The funeral was brief. We committed his body to the void at 9 o'clock the following morning, wrapped in our family colors. I spoke the ritual words the crew expected. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. Service eternal. I watched the wrapped form drift away from the launch bay, shrinking against the infinite black until I could no longer distinguish it from distant stars. Then I returned to the bridge and assumed the command throne. The leather was still warm from the previous shift's watch officer. My first year of command was cautious. I followed established routes my father had maintained. Bulk cargo runs between Forge Worlds and Agri Worlds, luxury goods transported to Hive World nobility, strategic materials moved under charter from the Imperial Navy. The profit margins were predictable, between 17% and 23% after operational costs, depending on the route and cargo. Enough to maintain the fleet, pay the crew, and expand slowly. Safe, legal, approved. I was bored within 8 months. The tedium wasn't immediate. The novelty of command sustained me initially, learning the rhythms of bridge operations, earning the trust of officers who'd served my father for decades, making the 1,000 small decisions that kept a trading fleet functional. But repetition eroded novelty. The same routes, the same cargo manifests with different dates, the same negotiations with the same factors and guild representatives, all operating within the same rigid frameworks of imperial commerce. The warrant represented freedom, in theory. In practice, I was ferrying grain and promethium on predetermined schedules. I met Valdier on footfall, the rogue trader port at the edge of the Coronis expanse. I'd gone there following rumors of new trade opportunities beyond the moor, the warp rift that served as gateway to the expanse's uncharted regions. Footfall was barely imperial, a free port where the Imperium's laws applied only loosely, where rogue traders from across the sector gathered to exchange information, recruit specialists, and conduct the kind of business that wouldn't survive scrutiny on more civilized worlds. Valdier operated a small exchange house in Footfall's commercial warrens, 3 levels below the main dock. I found him through a contact of a contact, a master of whispers named Kestor, who I'd paid 1,200 thrones for an introduction. The exchange house occupied a converted cargo bay, its walls lined with display cases containing curiosities that made my throat tighten when I first saw them. Eldar spirit stones, a Tau pulse rifle, Kroot genetic samples in stasis cylinders, Orc technology, crude but functional, items that should have been incinerated or delivered to the Inquisition, displayed like merchant wares. Valdier himself was unremarkable. Average height, thin build, augmented eyes that gleamed silver when light hit them at certain angles. He wore merchant's robes of good quality, dark blue with gold threading. His voice was quiet, cultured. He offered me recaf from an actual brewing service, not reconstituted paste. I accepted. "You have your father's caution in your face," he said, watching me examine his displays without touching anything. "He came here twice, years ago, looked, never bought. I respected that. Caution keeps traders alive." He sipped his recaf. "But caution also limits profit. Your father died wealthy by common standards, not wealthy by warrant holder standards. You understand the difference?" I did. Our fleet was modest. 6 vessels, one of them barely void-worthy, kept operational through constant repair. Our trade routes were profitable but competitive. A dozen other warrant holders worked the same lanes, margin cutting each other constantly. My father had died comfortable but not powerful. The warrant represented potential we'd never fully realized. "What you're displaying," I said carefully, "represents considerable risk. Risk and reward correlate directly." Valdier gestured to a spirit stone in the nearest case, a teardrop of wraithbone glowing with soft internal light. "That stone, authentic craftworld Eldar, recovered from a derelict. Worth perhaps 8,000 thrones to me. Worth 80,000 to the right collector on Nalfi. More if you find a buyer among the cold trade networks on Scintilla or Shikaf. The numbers arrested me. 10-fold profit margins. More than 10-fold. I'd been celebrating 23%. The right collector, I repeated, meaning someone engaged in illegal commerce, meaning someone who appreciates rarity and pays accordingly. Valdier's augmented eyes focused on me with unsettling steadiness. The Imperium is vast. Its laws are numerous and contradictory. What's heresy on one world is sanctioned research on another. What's forbidden to common citizens is permitted to rogue traders under the ancient rights of your warrant. You have legal authority to treat with Xenos when profit and necessity require it. The definition of necessity is flexible. I should have left. The rationalization was too smooth, too practiced, but I remained standing in that converted cargo bay, calculating. 80,000 thrones per stone. How many stones could one acquire? What other items commanded similar margins? Hypothetically, I said, if one were interested in such commerce, what would initial investment require? A precise expression of satisfaction, quickly controlled. "Come to my private office. Let's discuss hypotheticals." I purchased 3 items that day, not the spirit stone, too recognizable, too dangerous for a first venture. Instead, I bought a collection of Tau data cores containing technical specifications for water reclamation systems, a sealed container of Eldar healing unguents, and a Kroot genetic compatibility database. Total cost, 42,000 thrones. Valdier provided documentation listing them as recovered xenotech artifacts pending Adeptus Mechanicus review, legal enough to pass cursory inspection. I transported them to Malfi and sold them within 2 weeks. The data cores went to a tech priest interested in efficiency improvements for his forge complex. The unguents sold to a noble house's private Medicae. The genetic database found a buyer among the planet's Skolan biologies. Total revenue, 167,000 thrones. Profit, 125,000 thrones after bribes, transport costs, and Valdier's finder's fees. 298% return in 14 days. I sat in my quarters aboard the Vengeance of Markets after concluding the final sale. staring at the credit transfer confirmation on my data slate. The numbers didn't feel real. I'd made more profit in 2 weeks than 6 months of legitimate cargo runs. The calculation was simple and seductive. If I could replicate this quarterly, the fleet's wealth would increase exponentially. In 5 years, I could expand to 20 vessels. 10 years, perhaps 40. The warrant's potential finally realized. The rationalization came easily. I was conducting commerce, nothing more. The warrant explicitly permitted trade with Xenos when necessary. Profit was always necessary. How else could I maintain the fleet, employ the crew, fulfill my obligations? The buyers I'd sold to weren't criminals, respected institutions, a tech priest, a noble house, an official biologist division. If they wanted such items, clearly the items served legitimate purposes. I was simply facilitating the flow of goods that had strategic value to the Imperium. I was 33 years old. I didn't recognize the sophistication of my own delusion. The second purchase was larger. Valdier had mentioned a contact among the Tau, a water-caste merchant operating at the edge of the Damocles Gulf. The Tau, he explained, were practical. They valued trade, understood mutual benefit, didn't engage in the religious fanaticism that made dealing with most Xenos impossible. Their technology was sophisticated but not corrupted like chaos artifacts. Clean, safe, profitable. I traveled to the meeting site with 2 vessels, the Vengeance and the Escort Profits Margin. The coordinates took us 3 weeks through the warp, emerging at a barren system 8 light-years beyond the nearest Imperial world. The Tau merchant vessel waited at the designated coordinates, a sleek craft that made my ships look like industrial slag by comparison. The meeting occurred aboard neutral ground, a derelict orbital station that showed signs of ancient human habitation. The Tau representative called himself Pauvre Daliathkar. I never learned if that was a name or a title. He brought 3 guards, elegant soldiers in white and blue armor. I brought 6 armsmen who looked crude and brutal by comparison. Pauvre spoke fluent Gothic with a melodic accent. "We appreciate traders who see beyond superstition," he said, his face unreadable, features too smooth and symmetrical to easily interpret. "Your Imperium wastes potential in its dogma. We offer mutual prosperity." He displayed the goods available. Technology mostly. Advanced optics, compact power cells, medical scanners that surpassed Imperial equivalents in efficiency and size. Items that wealthy Imperial citizens would pay extravagant prices to acquire. Items that Forge worlds and tech priests would study with obsessive interest. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. I purchased goods worth 200,000 thrones, paying in Imperial currency, precious metals, and several crates of specialized ammunition the Tau apparently needed. The transaction was professional, clinical, just commerce between pragmatic parties. As we concluded, Pauvre said something that lodged in my memory. "Your Imperium teaches that we are enemies. Perhaps we are in some contexts. But in this context, we are partners in profit. Context matters more than category, yes?" I agreed. Context mattered. I was a rogue trader, not a soldier. My warrant gave me authority to make such contextual judgments. The Imperium itself had granted that authority. I sold those Tau goods across 3 systems over the next month. Every item found eager buyers. Total profit, 418,000 thrones. I returned to Pauvre twice more over the next year. The transactions grew larger, more comfortable. He began offering items beyond simple technology, intelligence about rival rogue traders, information about exploitable trade routes, even military equipment that found buyers among Imperial Guard officers willing to overlook provenance for superior firepower. My fleet expanded. I purchased 2 additional vessels, both better than the ships I'd inherited. Crew wages increased. I could afford better officers, better specialists. The navigator I hired cost me 800,000 thrones in contract fees, but she cut our warp transit times by 18%. Efficiency improved across all operations. And the legitimate cargo runs became supplementary income, almost negligible. Why spend 4 months hoarding grain for 19% margins when I could spend 2 weeks moving Xenos artifacts for 300% margins? The mathematics were undeniable. I was 35 when I first dealt with the Stricksus. They found me. I didn't seek them. A message delivered to Footfall's commercial exchange, requesting a meeting. I almost declined. The Stricksus had a reputation among rogue traders, alien merchants of notorious avarice, dealing in items too dangerous or corrupt for even the loosest markets. But curiosity and greed pulled me to the meeting. The Stricksus merchant called itself Vexashrakia, a creature that wore environment suit layers that made its true form impossible to discern. Only its head was partially visible. Angular, insectoid, with too many segments and sensory organs clustering around what might have been a mouth. "You have developed taste for profit that transcends law," it said, voice buzzing through vocal augmentation. "We appreciate this. We have items that bring profit beyond your current understanding." It showed me 3 things that day. I only remember 2 clearly. The third I've tried to forget, though I eventually purchased it anyway. The first was a device of unknown origin, vaguely spherical, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. Archaeotech, Vexashrakia claimed, from time before Imperium, generates power field of remarkable stability, worth millions to tech priest collectors. The second was a collection of biological samples the Stricksus claimed came from a previously unencountered Xenos species, something from beyond the galaxy's eastern fringe. Genetic material with remarkable properties. Adaptogenic, regenerative. Buyers in radical biological research would pay extravagantly. I told myself I would never touch items like that. Corruption was visible in it, a wrongness that made my skin crawl from across the room. Vexashrakia noticed my reaction and laughed, a chittering sound. Perhaps not yet ready for this. We keep for future, when profit overcomes squeamishness. I purchased the first 2 items. Cost 600,000 thrones, a third of my liquid capital at the time. Risk assessment, extreme. Profit potential, extraordinary. The Archaeotech sold to a Magos on a Forge world whose name I was instructed never to speak. He examined it for 4 hours before concluding the purchase. Payment: 2 million thrones. He asked no questions about provenance. Perhaps he already knew. Perhaps he didn't care. The biological samples took longer to sell. I held them for 7 months before finding a buyer. A representative of a noble house on Malfi conducting highly classified research into life extension. Payment: 1.8 million thrones. Total profit from that single Stricksus transaction, 3.2 million thrones. I was wealthy now by any standard. My fleet numbered 12 vessels. I employed over 90,000 souls across ships and support facilities. My family's warrant had finally achieved the prominence it promised. Other rogue traders spoke my name with respect. I received invitations to gatherings I'd previously only heard about. Exclusive meetings where the Imperium's most successful and least scrupulous warrant holders discussed opportunities beyond normal channels. The crew knew, of course, not the specifics, but the nature of our enterprise. I'd been careful to compartmentalize operations. Only my most trusted officers handled the forbidden cargo, and they were compensated well enough to ensure silence. But rumors spread inevitably. The rank and file understood that our profitable routes involved commerce the Imperium officially forbade. I told myself their complicity was acceptable. They prospered too. Wages on my ships exceeded sector standards by 40%. Survival rates were high. I could afford the best equipment, the best medici, the best ship maintenance. If we were engaging in technical heresy, at least we were safe, comfortable heretics. My conscience grew quieter with each transaction. The rationalization had evolved beyond "the warrant permits this" into something more cynical. The Imperium was corrupt already. Every institution, every official, every servant of the Golden Throne had their price. I'd paid bribes to administrative officials, to naval officers, to planetary governors. The system ran on hypocrisy, condemning in public what it tolerated in private, criminalizing in law what it permitted in practice. I wasn't corrupting anything. I was simply participating honestly in a corrupt system, accepting its nature rather than pretending otherwise. I met Seven on footfall during my 8th year of command. He was newly arrived, young, perhaps 22 Terran standard. He'd come seeking employment as a trade factor, bringing recommendation letters from commercial houses on Scintilla. The letters were impressive enough that I granted him an interview aboard the Vengeance of Markets. He sat across from me in my ready room, nervous but controlled. Dark hair, pale skin, grey eyes that focused intently when he spoke. He wore a trade factor's formal coat, slightly too large for his thin frame. First formal position, I guessed, trying to project competence he was still growing into. "I understand your fleet operates in unconventional markets," he said, after preliminary pleasantries concluded. His directness surprised me. Most applicants danced around the question. "Unconventional," I repeated. "Interesting choice of word. I've asked around footfall. Your reputation is clear. You deal in commodities that require discretion." He met my gaze steadily. "I'm not scandalized. I'm interested. Conventional trade is oversaturated. Profit margins collapse under competition. If unconventional markets offer better opportunities, I want to learn." His honesty was either refreshing or disturbing. I wasn't certain which. "You understand that unconventional often means illegal, dangerous. I understand that illegal and immoral aren't synonyms. That the Imperium's laws serve political purposes, not ethical ones." He leaned forward slightly. "I understand that you've built something remarkable here. I want to be part of it. Initially for conventional work, managing legitimate cargo manifests, coordinating with ports and factors on standard routes, testing his competence and discretion." He proved capable at both. Within 6 months, I brought him into the restricted operations, allowing him to observe negotiations with Valdier and eventually with Xenos contacts. He watched everything with focused intensity, absorbing details, asking precise questions, never judgmental, never hesitant, just curious, hungry to understand the mechanisms of profit in markets where normal rules dissolved. I began to rely on him. He had skills I lacked, an intuitive understanding of what buyers wanted before they articulated it, an ability to assess risk with cold mathematical precision, a talent for maintaining documentation that appeared legitimate under scrutiny while obscuring actual activities. He made the operation more efficient, more profitable. And somewhere in that 2nd year of working together, I realized I'd begun to trust him in ways I trusted no one else aboard the fleet. Not just professionally, personally. I found myself explaining decisions to him not because he needed the information, but because I wanted his opinion, wanted his approval, wanted confirmation that what we were doing made sense, was justified, was acceptable. He provided that confirmation. Always. "The Imperium demands impossible things," he said once, reviewing cargo manifests in my ready room. "Expansion without resources, victory without casualties, purity without compromise. We provide the compromise that makes the impossible possible. That's not corruption, that's necessity." His words became my words. His rationalization reinforced my own until I could no longer distinguish which thoughts originated from which mind. I was 41 when the transaction with the Stricksus went wrong. Vex Shrachia had offered another collection of archaeotech items, particularly valuable pieces it claimed came from a derelict discovered in the Halo stars. The items included weapons, technology, and the third thing it had shown me years earlier. The one I'd refused then. I didn't refuse anymore. 8 years of successful transactions had eroded whatever instinct had made me hesitate. It was just merchandise. Strange, disturbing merchandise, but merchandise nonetheless. If it generated profit, if buyers existed for it, then acquiring it was simply rational commerce. The meeting occurred at the same barren system where I'd first met Pauvre years earlier. We arrived to find Vex Shrakia's vessel already waiting. Standard procedure. We'd conducted 11 successful transactions across 6 years. Routine had made me complacent. The transfer began normally. My crew transported cargo containers from the Stricksus vessel to the Vengeance. Payment transferred through authenticated channels. Vekshakir's buzzing voice confirmed receipt, expressed satisfaction at continued partnership. Then proximity alarms screamed across the bridge. Sensor returns showing warp translation, multiple contacts, large signatures. Imperial Navy, 3 vessels, a cruiser and 2 frigates. Void shields already raised, weapons charging. I remembered the spike of ice fear through my chest, the sudden clarity that broke through years of comfortable rationalization. This was the moment I'd always known would arrive eventually, the moment where consequences became unavoidable. Battle stations, I ordered, voice surprisingly steady. Void shields maximum, prepare for evasive. The Stricksus vessel exploded, not from Navy fire, from internal detonation. Vekshakir had destroyed its own ship rather than face capture. Standard Stricksus practice, I'd learned later. They left no evidence, no survivors, no testimony. The Navy cruiser's Vox crackled across all channels. Rogue trader vessel Vengeance of Markets. This is Captain Horvath of the Imperial Navy cruiser Righteous Censure. You are ordered to stand down and prepare for boarding. You are suspected of trading in forbidden xenotech and consorting with Xenos enemies of the Imperium. Resistance will be met with destruction. I looked at Seven, standing at his station near the tactical display. His face was pale but composed. He met my eyes and nodded once. Agreement. Understanding. We'd known this was possible. We'd discussed contingencies. Navigator, I said quietly. Emergency warp translation. Any direction. Maximum speed. Sir, we're too close to the stellar mass. The calculations. Now. The Vengeance of Markets lurched into the warp without proper preparation, without safe calculations, without the rituals and precautions that made warp travel survivable. The Gellerfield strained immediately. Reality twisted. Crew members on lower decks reported seeing impossible things through corridor walls. Faces, geometries, colors that shouldn't exist. We survived. Barely. 3 crew members died from warp exposure psychosis. 17 more required sedation and restraint. But we escaped. The Navy had our identity. They'd recorded our ship's signature, would have reported it to Sector Command. The warrant of trade I'd inherited from my father was now marked, tainted. Every Imperial port would have orders to detain us on sight. We couldn't return to legitimate trade. That avenue was closed. The Navy had forced me across a threshold I'd been approaching for years, but had never quite crossed, from rogue trader to actual rogue. I sold the archaeotech anyway, found buyers through increasingly dangerous channels, networks that operated entirely outside Imperial authority. Made 7 million thrones from that cursed Stricksus cargo. The money felt meaningless. I'd lost something I hadn't realized I valued. The fiction of legitimacy. The comfortable lie that I was still operating within some acceptable boundary, that the warrant's authority protected me, that I was bending rules rather than breaking them completely. Seven found me in my quarters 3 days after our escape, staring at the warrant document I'd inherited 13 years earlier. The parchment looked unchanged, same seals, same elaborate script. But it meant something different now. Or perhaps it had always meant what it meant now, and I'd simply chosen not to see it. We survived, Seven said quietly. The crew is stable. We have resources. We can continue. As what? I asked. As fugitives? Pirates? As traders operating beyond Imperial limitations? He sat across from me. The Imperium is not the galaxy. The warrant gives us authority that transcends Imperial law. That's its fundamental purpose. We're finally operating in the space the warrant was designed for. Beyond borders, beyond oversight, where profit and survival determine success. He was right, in a sense. Rogue traders had always existed in moral gray space. Some of the Imperium's most celebrated warrant holders had been criminals by any reasonable standard, privateers and opportunists who'd enriched themselves while claiming to serve the Golden Throne. But I couldn't summon the energy for rationalization anymore. I'd lost something in that escape, some capacity for self-deception. I could still justify the actions. Profit was profit. Survival was survival. But I couldn't pretend anymore that I was anything other than what I'd become. "I can't stop," I said finally. Not to Seven, just speaking the recognition aloud. "Even if I wanted to. We're committed now. The fleet depends on this, 90,000 people relying on income I can only generate through forbidden commerce. If I stop, we collapse. If I continue, we prosper. The choice was made years ago." Seven nodded, reached across and gripped my shoulder briefly. "Then we continue. We do it well. We survive. That's all anyone does in this galaxy." I continued. We continued. The fleet moved deeper into the spaces between imperial authority and absolute lawlessness. Found new markets, new contacts, new buyers for goods that should never be bought or sold. The profit continued. The corruption continued. And I stopped trying to distinguish between the two. The years compressed after the Navy incident. Not immediately. Time still felt measured in those first months as fugitives, each day distinct as we navigated the constant tension of operating outside Imperial protection. But gradually, inevitably, the pattern established itself, and individual events blurred into continuous process. We operated from the edges. Footfall became our primary base, though even there we maintained low profile. Too many bounty hunters, too many informants who'd sell information to the Navy for the right price. I established secondary facilities. A hidden dock in an asteroid field near the Processional of the Damned, a converted orbital platform in a dead system 12 light-years from the nearest inhabited world. A network of contacts who could move goods without direct involvement of my ships. The fleet grew despite our fugitive status, or perhaps because of it. Without the constraints of imperial regulation, without the need to maintain even the appearance of legitimacy, profit margins expanded dramatically. I purchased vessels that other traders couldn't or wouldn't touch. Ships with questionable registries, salvaged hulks rebuilt with Xenos technology, fast raiders designed for commerce that required speed over respectability. By my 45th year of life, 12 years after inheriting the warrant, the fleet numbered 23 vessels. Crew population exceeded 200,000 when counting ground facilities and support personnel. Revenue exceeded what my father had generated across his entire 40-year career. I'd achieved everything the warrant promised, and I'd lost everything that justified the achievement. Seven managed most operations by then. He'd developed into something remarkable. A trade factor who understood forbidden markets with intuitive brilliance, who could negotiate with Xenos as easily as with human criminals, who maintained networks of contacts across 3 sector groups. He was 30 years old and already more valuable to the operation than I was. I'd begun to notice something changing in him around his 4th year with the fleet. Small details initially. The way he no longer hesitated before certain decisions. The calculations he made that prioritized profit over safety, with precision that felt cold even to me. The efficiency with which he terminated contracts with crew members who demonstrated insufficient loyalty or discretion. He'd become what I'd made him, what the operation required, a perfect instrument of immoral commerce. I tried once to discuss it, sitting in my ready room during a supply stop at our asteroid facility. He was reviewing manifests, cross-referencing cargo with buyer requests, optimization processing that never seemed to stop. "Do you ever question what we're doing?" I asked. He looked up from his data slate, gray eyes focusing with that intense attention he brought to everything. "Question in what sense?" "Whether the profit justifies the compromise." He was quiet for perhaps 10 seconds, considering the question seriously, not dismissing it. "I think," he said finally, "that morality is a luxury that requires security. The Imperium provides neither morality nor security, only demands for obedience that serve its perpetuation. We exist outside the Imperium's protection. Therefore, we exist outside its moral framework. We create our own security through profit and efficiency. Whether that's justified is meaningless. It's necessary. Necessity is the only justification that matters. His words sounded like my words, the rationalizations I'd constructed years earlier. Hearing them spoken back to me created a strange disconnect, like listening to a recording of your own voice and not recognizing it. "You believe that?" I asked. "Don't you?" He leaned back slightly. "You taught me this. You showed me that the Imperium's rules serve power, not truth. That its morality is selective, enforced against the weak, and ignored by the strong. We're strong now. We make our own rules. That's what the warrant means. The authority to exist beyond the systems that crush everyone else." I had taught him that, explicitly and through example. He'd learned perfectly. "Sometimes I wonder," I said quietly, "if we've just replaced one system's crushing weight with another. If we're any freer than we were before." Seven shook his head. "We're alive. We're prosperous. The crew is well compensated and secure. What more freedom could exist than that?" I didn't have an answer. The question felt important, but I couldn't articulate why. The philosophical ground had shifted beneath me gradually across 12 years, until I could no longer find stable footing. I'd lost whatever moral framework might have allowed me to answer Seven's challenge. So I returned to what I understood. Profit, efficiency, survival. The operation continued. The Stricksus became our primary suppliers by my 46th year. Vex Schrakier had died, or whatever passed for death among the Stricksus, but its successor maintained the relationship. The new merchant called itself Thex Carveen, and it dealt in items that made Vex Schrakier's goods seem innocuous by comparison. I knew what some of those items were: archaeotech that bore the taint of the warp, biological materials harvested from forbidden sources, weapons that violated every principle the Mechanicus held sacred, information that could compromise Imperial operations across entire subsectors. Items that weren't just illegal, they were dangerous, corrupting. Some of them whispered, psychically, or actually, I was never certain which. I sold them anyway, to buyers who didn't care about danger, who valued power and rarity above safety. Radical tech priests. Chaos cultists operating in Imperial society's shadows, though I tried not to know that detail explicitly. Nobles and officers so wealthy and protected that consequences couldn't reach them. Anyone with sufficient currency and sufficient moral vacancy to purchase what I provided. The profit was extraordinary, also irrelevant. I'd accumulated more wealth than I could meaningfully spend. The fleet's operational costs were covered for decades, even if we ceased all commerce immediately. I continued not because I needed the wealth, but because stopping would require confronting what I'd become, and that confrontation felt more terrifying than any risk the commerce itself presented. Seven understood this without me explaining it. He managed increasingly dangerous transactions while I retreated into strategic oversight, distancing myself from the specific horrors of individual deals. He never questioned my withdrawal, never asked why I'd stopped accompanying him to negotiations, stopped inspecting cargo personally, stopped wanting details about what we transported or who purchased it. He protected me from knowing, and I was grateful for that protection, which was its own form of corruption. The crew changed, too. Not all at once, but gradually, like metal exposed to corrosive atmosphere. We'd lost personnel to the Navy incident, and replacements came from different sources than my father had used. Fewer recruitment centers, fewer properly trained ratings, more criminals seeking refuge, more desperate individuals with nowhere else to go, more people for whom the Imperium had already failed so completely that working for a fugitive rogue trader represented improvement. They were loyal mostly. The compensation ensured that, but their loyalty was transactional, not ideological. They served because they were paid, not because they believed in anything. Many had been exposed to the cargo we transported, had seen things that left marks impossible to fully heal. Some developed tics, obsessive behaviors, patterns of speech that suggested psychological damage. The fleet's Medicaid did what they could, but some contaminations went deeper than medicine could reach. I should have cared more, should have implemented better protocols, better screening, better protection for crew who worked the forbidden cargo. But implementing such measures would have required acknowledging explicitly what we were transporting and what it was doing to my people. Acknowledgement felt impossible, so I maintained the comfortable fiction of ignorance and let the slow corruption continue. By my 48th year, 16 years after inheriting the warrant, I'd almost stopped remembering what I'd originally wanted. The warrant had promised freedom, exploration, the opportunity to build something meaningful at the edges of imperial space. I'd achieved wealth and influence instead, built atop a foundation of systematic moral compromise that had transformed from choice into necessity, into identity. I was no longer Liran Moravec, the rogue trader. I was Liran Moravec, the criminal, the heretic, the corrupter, the merchant of forbidden things. The warrant I carried was just a piece of parchment now, its legal authority void, its seals meaningless except as reminder of what I'd inherited and destroyed. 7 found me in my quarters late one ship cycle, nearly 3 o'clock by shipboard time. I'd been drinking, not a Masek. I'd sold my father's bottles years ago, but cheap distilled spirits purchased at footfall. The kind that burned going down and left your head aching the following morning. Appropriate, somehow. "We have a problem," 7 said without preamble. He looked tired, which was unusual. He rarely showed fatigue. Which kind? Too many varieties of problems existed in our operation. Betrayals, competition, Navy patrols, cargo containment failures, buyer disputes. The Inquisition kind. Ice crystallized in my chest, cutting through the alcohol fog immediately. "Explain." "Our contact on Nalfi sent warning. An inquisitor named Voke has been investigating cold trade networks across the sector. He's thorough, methodical. He's tracked several operations back to common sources. We're on his list." 7 sat across from me, his gray eyes reflecting the dim illumination of my ready room. He has testimony from buyers. Cargo manifests. Testimony from crew members who left the fleet. How long do we have? Unknown. Could be months. Could be weeks. Voke doesn't operate on predictable timelines. 7 leaned forward. We need to consider options. We could scatter the fleet, make it harder to target us all simultaneously. We could go deeper into the expanse, beyond where even the Inquisition typically operates. Or what? We could make a deal, provide Voke with information about larger operations in exchange for reduced scrutiny of ours, sacrifice competitors to buy safety. The suggestion should have shocked me. It didn't. That was how far I'd descended. Betraying others to protect myself felt like rational tactics, not moral horror. Who would we give him? I asked. 7 had clearly already considered this. Merchant houses on footfall, other rogue traders operating in similar markets. Stricksus contacts. The Inquisition values information about Xenos networks above individual human traders. We could provide significant intelligence. We discussed it for 2 hours. The calculations, the risks, the potential benefits. Clinical evaluation of how to betray others to survive. Not once during that conversation did I question whether such betrayal was acceptable, only whether it was effective. We never implemented the plan. Events overtook us before we could act. The betrayal came from within. A rival trader named Haderach, someone I'd known peripherally for years, had apparently been compiling evidence about my operations while conducting his own forbidden commerce. He'd fed information to Inquisitor Voke, providing detailed testimony about my fleet's activities in exchange for immunity for himself. The Inquisition struck 3 weeks after Sivan's warning. Not at our ships directly. Voke was too sophisticated for that. Instead, he targeted our network. Contacts arrested simultaneously across 5 worlds, buyers detained and interrogated, facilities raided, bank accounts frozen, supply chains severed. Within 1 week, the infrastructure I'd spent 16 years building was crippled. Not destroyed completely. Some elements survived, some contacts escaped, but damaged beyond rapid recovery. The fleet scattered as planned in our contingencies. 23 vessels dispersing to different systems, different hiding locations, awaiting signal to regroup. 7 coordinated the dispersal from the vengeance of markets, managing communication protocols, ensuring each ship's captain understood their designated routes and safe harbors. I should have been managing it myself. Should have been fully engaged in the crisis. Instead, I found myself standing in my ready room, staring at my father's warrant, trying to remember what I'd felt the day I inherited it. Trying to remember who I'd been at 32, what hopes I'd carried, what vision of success I'd imagined. The memory was corrupted, inaccessible. The person who'd inherited that warrant was as distant and incomprehensible as the grandfather who'd earned it 4 generations prior. "Sir," Seven's voice from the doorway, "we need to make decisions about regrouping protocols. The dispersal is complete, but we need long-term strategy." I turned to face him. 32 years old now, the same age I'd been when my father died, but so much older in the ways that mattered. Hardened by 8 years of managing operations that systematically destroyed moral boundaries, made efficient and cold by the work I'd given him. "I destroyed you," I said. The words came without conscious decision, simply emerging from whatever remained of my conscience. Seven's expression didn't change. "What? When you came to me at 22, you were—" I struggled to articulate what I'd recognized in retrospect. "You were capable of becoming something better than this. You had intelligence, capability, ambition. You could have been a legitimate trader, a factor for an honest house, something that didn't require—" I gestured vaguely at the ready room, at the ship around us, at the invisible network of corruption we'd built. "This. I chose this," Seven said quietly. "You offered opportunity. I accepted. Every decision afterward was mine. I taught you to rationalize. I taught you to value profit over principle. I taught you that the Imperium's morality was meaningless, that only success and survival mattered. I made you into—" I couldn't finish. Into what? Into me. Into the thing I'd become. Savan crossed the room, stood close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his face, the stress fractures the crisis had created. "You taught me to survive in the galaxy as it actually exists, not as the Imperium pretends it is. Yes, we've compromised. Yes, we've dealt with Xenos, transported forbidden goods, enriched ourselves through commerce the Imperium condemns. But we've also provided employment to thousands, facilitated trade that benefited worlds the Imperium couldn't supply, moved technology that improved lives. The balance isn't entirely negative. The rationalization was sophisticated, complex, and completely hollow. I could hear the emptiness in it, the desperate attempt to construct meaning from actions that had none beyond self-interest. "Do you believe that?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, quietly, honestly, "I need to believe it. Otherwise, what have I spent 8 years becoming?" The honesty broke something in me, or completed a breaking that had been occurring gradually across 16 years. I'd corrupted him not through force, but through example. Through teaching him to think exactly as I thought, to rationalize exactly as I rationalized. He'd become my perfect mirror, reflecting back the moral void I'd cultivated. "We need to dissolve the fleet," I said. "Pay out the crew. Destroy the network completely. Stop. We can't stop." Seven's voice remained calm but carried an edge of desperation I'd never heard before. 200,000 people depend on our operations for survival. Stopping means abandoning them, leaving them without employment, without protection, without— Stopping means ending our complicity in systematic corruption. Those people can find other employment, legitimate employment. Where? Now anger entered his voice. The Imperium that's hunting us, the Navy that wants us dead, the Inquisition that considers everyone we've employed tainted by association. We created a system that depends on us. We can't simply abandon it because you've developed a conscience after 16 years. He was right. The logic was inescapable. We'd built something that couldn't be dismantled without destroying thousands of lives. Stopping was impossible not because I lacked will, but because the consequences of stopping exceeded my capacity to accept them. That was how corruption worked, I understood finally. Not as dramatic transformation, but as gradual entanglement, each choice constraining the next until all options narrowed to different expressions of the same fundamental compromise. You didn't fall into damnation. You built it carefully, decision by decision, until you couldn't remember how to exist outside its structure. Then we continue, I said, voice empty. We regroup what remains, find new contacts, rebuild. Seven nodded, relief visible in his face. We survive. That's all we've ever done. But survival as what? The question remained unanswered, because answering it required confronting truths I still couldn't fully face. The regrouping took 4 months. 11 of 23 vessels responded to the recall signals. The others were lost, captured by Imperial forces, destroyed, or simply disappeared into the void. Crew population dropped to approximately 80,000. Resources were depleted but not exhausted. We could continue, though at reduced scale. We established new base of operations in a system called Zaith, an abandoned mining colony at the edge of the Halo stars. The Imperium had written the system off decades earlier when the mineral deposits ran out. Perfect for our needs, far from authority, easily defended, large enough to support fleet operations. 7 managed the reconstruction. I'd withdrawn further, retreating into strategic planning that kept me distant from operational details. I couldn't stop the operation. The logic of impossibility that Savan had articulated held firm. But I could stop pretending I accepted it, could stop rationalizing, could simply exist in the horror I'd created, acknowledging it without justifying it. It was its own form of torture, awareness without power to change, complicity without acceptance, continuing to enable what I recognized as corruption because ending it would create greater immediate harm. Seven threw himself into the work with intensity that concerned me. He was sleeping less, I'd noticed. 4 hours per cycle, sometimes less, driving himself to rebuild what the Inquisition had damaged, compensating for my withdrawal by absorbing more responsibilities himself. I should have recognized the warning signs, should have insisted he rest, delegate, accept that we'd been diminished and would remain so. But I was grateful for his intensity because it allowed my withdrawal. I was using him exactly as I'd always used him, as instrument of my own moral evasion. The transaction that killed him involved a purchase from the Stricksus. Thex Carvine had acquired something special, it claimed, something worth extraordinary profit. It required meeting at neutral ground for transfer, standard protocol for particularly valuable or dangerous cargo. Seven volunteered to manage the negotiation personally. I should have refused. Should have recognized he was overextended, operating beyond sustainable capacity. Should have gone myself, resumed direct involvement rather than continuing to hide behind delegation. I didn't refuse. I authorized the mission, assigned 3 ships as escort, provided 7 with authentication codes and trade credit. Standard procedure. Nothing about the preparation suggested catastrophic outcome. He departed aboard the escort Profits Margin with crew of 43. Expected duration, 2 weeks including transit time. He never returned. The first indication of disaster came through fragmentary Vox transmission, 17 days after departure. Audio only, degraded by warp interference and distance. Seven's voice, barely recognizable through distortion. Containment failure. Cargo compromised. Something in the... then nothing. Silence that continued for 6 hours until a probe drone we dispatched to the meeting coordinates returned with sensor data. The Profits Margin was destroyed, not from weapons fire, from internal explosion. The debris field showed patterns consistent with catastrophic decompression, multiple breaches originating from cargo holds. Whatever the Stricksus had been selling had gotten loose, had killed the ship from inside. No survivors. No escape pods detected. 43 crew deaths, including 7. I received the probe's data in my ready room, alone at 22:17 shipboard time. I'd been reviewing fleet logistics, routine administrative work. The data appeared on my display without warning, without preparation. Just facts delivered through clinical formatted report. Ship destroyed. All hands lost. Cargo unrecoverable. Thex Carveen's vessel not present at coordinates. The Stricksus had fled or been destroyed. Debris field cooling. No thermal signatures indicating survivors. I read the report 3 times. The words didn't change. The reality they described remained constant. 7 was dead. Had died approximately 11 hours earlier based on decay analysis of the debris field. Had died while I was eating evening meal, or sleeping, or performing routine bridge duties. Had died and I hadn't known, had continued existing normally while he ceased existing. I tried to process it clinically. Death was common in our operations. We'd lost crew members regularly, to accidents, to violence, to the slow attrition of living outside Imperial protection. 7's death was statistically inevitable given the risks we accepted. Just another casualty of the profession we'd chosen. The clinical framework failed, shattered against the simple fact that 7 was gone and would never return. That the person I'd relied on most completely, had corrupted most thoroughly, had trusted in ways I'd trusted no one else, no longer existed. I sat in my ready room for hours, staring at the data report, trying to feel something beyond the numb emptiness that had consumed me. Grief felt appropriate, but wouldn't come. Guilt felt appropriate, but I'd exhausted that capacity years earlier. Anger felt appropriate, but had no target. The Stricksus were gone. 7 had volunteered, the cargo's nature was unknown. What remained was recognition. Not dramatic understanding, not philosophical breakthrough. Just simple clinical recognition of what I'd done. I'd sent him to that negotiation. I'd trained him to accept such risks as normal. I'd created the operation that required someone to manage transactions dangerous enough to kill. I'd corrupted him gradually across 8 years until he'd internalized my values, my rationalizations, my acceptance of risk for profit. And then I'd let him die in service of that corruption, while I remained safe, distant, protected by the very delegation that had killed him. The architecture of guilt was suddenly terribly clear. Not the dramatic guilt of a single terrible choice, but the systematic guilt of 10,000 small choices, each one defensible individually, collectively creating a machine that consumed people and produced profit. 7 was just the most visible casualty of a system I'd built deliberately, efficiently, successfully. I told him once that I'd destroyed him. He'd disagreed, claimed agency, insisted he'd chosen his path. But I understood now what I'd meant. I hadn't destroyed his capacity to choose. I destroyed his capacity to choose differently than I would choose. Had made him into an extension of myself, a tool that thought it was autonomous while executing my will perfectly. And I'd sent that tool into danger I wouldn't face personally, and it had been destroyed, and that destruction was the logical outcome of everything I'd built. I processed this information across hours that felt both infinite and instantaneous, time distorted. I'd look at chronometer display and expect minutes had passed, discover hours gone. Look again, expecting hours passed, discover only minutes. At some point I stood, left my ready room. Walked through the vengeance of market's corridors without destination, just moving because stillness felt impossible. Crew members noticed me, stepped aside, offered respectful greetings. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Was too occupied processing the reality of loss that made all other interactions meaningless. I ended up in the forward observation deck, an empty compartment with armored viewports showing real space. Zaith's primary star was visible, distant and cold. The mining colony's abandoned facilities showed as dark structures against darker space. I stood there for a long time, watching nothing, Thinking about Seven at 22, nervous in my ready room during his first interview, trying to project competence he'd eventually develop. Thinking about Seven at 30, managing negotiations with Xenos merchants like he'd been born to it. Thinking about Seven grey-eyed and exhausted, telling me he needed to believe our work had meaning because otherwise, what had he become? He'd become what I made him. And then he'd died, serving what I'd made him into. The grief came finally, not as dramatic emotion, but as slow realization settling into my body like radiation poisoning. Invisible. Cumulative. Quietly lethal. Something had broken in me that would not repair. Seven's death wasn't the cause. It was the revelation of damage that had been accumulating across 16 years, hidden by rationalization and self-deception. I returned to my ready room eventually, sat at my desk, composed notification to Fleet Command regarding Seven's death and succession of his responsibilities, clinical language, formal procedures. The operation continued because the operation always continued. People died, but the system they'd served persisted. I managed the fleet for another 3 years after Seven's death. Reduced operations, diminished ambitions, but functional. Profitable enough to sustain crew and vessels. I hired other factors to replace Seven's role. None achieved his capabilities. None mattered the way he'd mattered. I was careful about that. Deliberately cultivated emotional distance, maintained purely transactional relationships, ensured no one could matter enough to destroy me again when they inevitably died. The operation became mechanical. I processed decisions without investment, managed logistics without caring about outcomes beyond maintaining basic functionality. Profit continued, but felt abstract. Numbers changing on accounts that had lost all meaning beyond utility for purchasing supplies and paying crew. The crew noticed my withdrawal. Senior officers approached me periodically, expressing concern, asking if I needed medical evaluation or rest. I reassured them with practiced lies about grief processing and strategic reconsideration. They accepted the lies because believing them was easier than acknowledging their commander had fundamentally broken. I began thinking about what would happen if I simply stopped. Not dramatically, no grand gesture of conscience, no attempt at redemption, just stopped. Left the fleet under command of the senior officers, took a shuttle to some remote world, disappeared into anonymity. Let the system continue without me since it clearly didn't require my presence to function. The fantasy was seductive. Release from responsibility, from the weight of choices I'd made and couldn't unmake. Freedom through abandonment. I never implemented it. Not from moral obligation or sense of duty, but from simple inertia. Stopping required choosing something else, some alternative existence. I couldn't imagine what that existence might be. Couldn't conceive of identity beyond the role I'd inhabited for 19 years. So I continued, diminished, broken, but continuing. The final betrayal came during my 51st year, 3 years after Seven's death, 19 years after inheriting the warrant. A rival trader, one of the contacts I'd worked with for years, sold information about our Zaith facility to an inquisitorial agent, not Voke, someone else. A different investigation converging on the same targets. The warning came with 4 hours' notice. Enough time to evacuate, not enough time to save the infrastructure we'd built. I ordered immediate withdrawal, authorized destruction of sensitive materials, directed the fleet to emergency dispersal coordinates. The Vengeance of Markets was the last vessel to depart Zaith. I watched from the bridge as the facilities we'd constructed were consumed by demolition charges, years of work erased in cascading explosions. Watched the Inquisition fleet translate into the system just as we entered warp translation, their weapon signatures reaching for us across the void. We escaped. Again. As I'd escaped 19 years earlier from Captain Horvath and the Righteous Censure, the pattern repeating because I'd never broken it had only continued deeper into the spiral it traced. The fleet scattered completely this time. No regrouping protocols, no attempt to maintain coherent structure, just survival, each vessel for itself. Some ships would survive, find other employment, continue existing. Others would be captured or destroyed. The operation I'd built across 19 years dissolved in hours, fragments dispersing into the void. I kept the vengeance of markets and 3 smaller vessels, skeleton fleet manned by crew too loyal or too compromised to go elsewhere. We became what I'd avoided acknowledging for years. Actual pirates, not rogue traders operating in legal gray space, not merchants dealing in forbidden goods, but criminals preying on weaker vessels and isolated facilities to survive. The descent was now complete. From legitimate trade to forbidden commerce, to fugitive operations to outright piracy. The progression I'd spent 19 years denying had reached its logical conclusion. I commanded the vengeance of markets for 2 more years in that reduced state. Raiding supply convoys, attacking merchant vessels, taking what we needed through violence rather than commerce. The crew adapted. Some deserted, unable to accept the transformation. Others embraced it. Piracy was more honest than what we'd been doing before, required less self-deception, created no illusion of legitimacy to maintain. I adapted too. Or perhaps I'd already adapted years earlier and was only now acknowledging it. The violence felt appropriate. Consequences made visible rather than hidden behind commercial transactions. When we attacked a vessel and killed its crew, the deaths were immediate, undeniable. Not like the slow corruption of trafficking forbidden artifacts, where consequences remained abstracted and distant. I was 53 Terran Standard, 21 years past inheriting the warrant, when I finally stopped. Not through choice or moral awakening, but through exhaustion. The vengeance of markets required repairs we couldn't afford. Crew desertions had reduced our numbers to unsustainable levels. Resources were depleted. The fleet was dying not from dramatic catastrophe, but from simple attrition. I sold the remaining vessels to a scrap merchant operating at the edge of the Ghoul Stars, paid out the remaining crew from the proceeds, kept enough currency for personal survival and transportation. Then I took passage on a free trader heading into the Halo Stars, destination unimportant. Just away, just somewhere else. The warrant of trade, my father's inheritance, I left aboard the vengeance of markets when I sold it, let it go to scrap with the ship. It meant nothing anymore. Its seals void, its authority recognized nowhere. Just parchment and wax. Physical reminder of what I'd inherited and destroyed. I exist now in spaces between imperial authority and absolute lawlessness. Space stations and border posts and free ports where questions aren't asked, where currency purchases anonymity. I survive on what remains of the wealth I accumulated, resources sufficient for perhaps another decade if I'm careful. I don't work, don't trade, don't seek profit or opportunity. I exist, process, remember. Mostly I remember 7. His face at 22, eager and nervous. At 30, exhausted and desperate. The way he'd look at me when he needed validation that what we were doing made sense, was justified, was acceptable. The validation I'd always provided because providing it served my own need for justification. I destroyed him. Not through single act, but through systematic corruption of his capacity to choose anything except what served my operation. He thought he had agency. He was right in the most useless way. He chose, but I'd constructed the framework within which choosing occurred, had shaped the options available until all his choices led to the same outcome. And then I'd sent him to die serving that framework while I remained safe and distant and protected. Other people died too. Thousands across 21 years, crew members killed in operations I authorized, buyers corrupted by artifacts I sold, innocents harmed by weapons I trafficked, worlds damaged by intelligence I provided to those who'd use it for profit regardless of consequences. I log them when I can remember specifics, names if I knew them, descriptions if I didn't. The accounting is incomplete. Too many deaths, too many impacts impossible to track. But I record what I can, because recording is all that remains. Testimony for no one to no purpose, simply because the act of testimony is what you do when action is no longer possible. The Imperium was right about the warrant system, I understand now. Not right in the way it claims, the propaganda about holy mission and service to the Golden Throne. Right in the deeper, darker truth. Rogue traders are necessary corruptions. The Imperium requires trade beyond its borders, commerce with Xenos, acquisition of forbidden knowledge. Requires it but cannot acknowledge requiring it. So it grants warrants to families, gives them authority to operate beyond imperial law, benefits from their work while maintaining moral distance from their methods. We were never meant to be heroes or explorers. We were meant to be criminals with official authorization, doing the work the Imperium needed while accepting the guilt it couldn't bear. I accepted that guilt, embraced it, built an empire on it, and it consumed me exactly as it was designed to, exactly as it consumes every warrant holder who doesn't die before achieving full understanding of what they've become. The compromise was always the corruption. The first forbidden transaction, the first step beyond legal boundary. That was when I was lost. Everything afterward was just elaboration on the initial fall, variations on the same fundamental choice to prioritize profit over principle. I couldn't have stopped. The logic 7 articulated held firm. Stopping meant abandoning people who depended on me, meant consequences worse than continuation. But I could have chosen not to start. Could have refused Valdier's initial offer, maintained the boring legitimate commerce my father had conducted, accepted modest success over spectacular corruption. I didn't. And that choice, made at 33 with full awareness of what it meant, even though I pretended otherwise, determined everything that followed. The Imperium will continue. The warrant system will continue. Other traders will inherit documents like the one I abandoned, will face the same choices I faced, will make the same rationalizations I made. Some will resist longer than I did. Some will fall faster. But the outcome is predetermined by the system's design. Everyone who participates becomes corrupted because participation itself is corruption. I was not unique, not especially weak or especially evil. Just a person granted authority beyond what any person should possess, placed in situations where profit and survival aligned against morality, given permission to rationalize through official documentation that claimed to make the forbidden permissible. And I used that authority exactly as I was meant to use it, and it destroyed me exactly as it was meant to destroy me, and the Imperium benefited from both my work and my destruction exactly as it was designed to. That is what the warrant means. That is what being a rogue trader means. Freedom to choose corruption, authority to pretend corruption is service, inevitable recognition that you've become the thing you justified yourself against. I record this testimony from a station called Hermitage, 5 days' journey through the warp from the nearest inhabited world. The station is old, possibly dating to the dark age of technology, maintained by a community of exiles and refugees who ask no questions about past or purpose. I've lived here for 2 years. I expect to live here until resources run out or systems fail. I am 55 Terran Standard. The warrant I inherited at 32 would have granted authority for another 30 years minimum, possibly 50. I've abandoned that authority. Walked away from everything it represented. The fleet is scattered. The crew dispersed. The operation dissolved. But the corruption persists. In the artifacts I sold that still exist somewhere, being used by someone. In the connections I facilitated between Xenos merchants and human criminals. In the example I set for others seeking to exploit the warrant system's inherent moral void. 7 died at 32. The same age I was when I inherited the warrant. The symmetry feels meaningful, though I cannot articulate why. Perhaps because 32 was the age when choices still mattered, when the path hadn't yet narrowed to inevitability. He died at that moment of potential, still believing what we did had meaning, still capable of needing justification. I envied him that. Still envy him. He never reached the age where rationalization fails completely, where you understand fully what you've become and lack any capacity to choose differently. He died thinking he had agency, that his choices meant something beyond serving a system designed to consume him. I know better now. Know that agency existed only within frameworks that predetermined outcomes. Know that every choice I made was choice within choicelessness, freedom within bondage, action within paralysis. The Imperium calls this the freedom of the warrant. It's the freedom of falling, the freedom to choose how you describe your trajectory, but not to alter your destination. I fell for 21 years. 7 fell for 10. The crew, the contacts, the buyers, all fell for whatever duration they intersected with the operation I built. We all hit the same ground eventually. The ground is made of the accumulation of compromises we called necessary, rationalizations we called wisdom, corruption we called commerce. I am sitting now in a small compartment on a forgotten station at the edge of mapped space. The compartment contains a cot, a waste disposal unit, a small desk, a data slate, nothing else. My wealth, once sufficient to purchase systems, reduced to resources adequate for basic survival. The data slate contains this testimony. No one will read it. I have no crew to transmit it to, no authority to submit it to, no purpose for its existence beyond the act of recording. But I record anyway, because testimony is what remains when action is impossible, when redemption is unavailable, when nothing exists except the need to state clearly what occurred. I was a rogue trader. I inherited authority to operate beyond imperial law. I used that authority to build a commercial empire founded on systematic moral corruption. I destroyed countless lives, including my own. I knew what I was doing throughout, justified it through rationalization that I understood was false even while constructing it. I could not stop because stopping would have had consequences I couldn't accept, which itself was a choice, which itself was corruption. The Imperium designed the system that made this inevitable. But I participated willingly, eagerly, profitably. Both things are true. Neither thing excuses the other. I exist now as consciousness processing guilt I cannot resolve, responsibility I cannot repay, damage I cannot repair. I function only as testament, as archive, as record of what the warrant system does to those who accept its promises. The Emperor does not protect. The warrant does not liberate. Profit does not justify. Commerce is not neutral. Necessity is not innocence. These are the things I know now, 23 years too late, archived in consciousness that will persist until biological systems fail and awareness finally ends. I was corrupted gradually across 21 years, each choice constraining the next, until corruption was not something I participated in, but something I was. The separation between self and system dissolved completely. I became the corruption that had consumed me. That is the truth the Imperium's warrant system produces. That is what I testify to from this forgotten station at the edge of the void. I cannot change it, cannot repair it, cannot redeem it. I can only record it. Complete the record. Bear witness for no one to the mechanisms of my own systematic destruction. The record is complete. The testimony is given. Nothing remains except continuation until continuation is no longer possible. I am Liren Moravec. I was a rogue trader. I destroyed everything I touched, including myself. This is what I witnessed. This is what I did. This is what I became. Let the archive hold what I cannot.